Hi everyone, welcome back to the webinar. Today is all about Donald J. Trump. The world seems to be all about Donald J. Trump at the moment. It's been an extraordinary few weeks. I'm going to try and make sense of everything today. And before I do that, just a disclaimer, as always, my job is to be a professional investor and therefore to discern what is happening and what is likely to happen, not necessarily what I would like to happen. And so this is an objective view. It's an honest assessment of what I think is happening and what is likely to happen, because that affects us all clearly in the world. And I think it's important to get to the signal from the noise amidst all this noise. And so I'm going to talk about the plan, Trump's grand plan. There is a plan. I will go through it. And if there's a plan, there must be something to fix. So what actually is the problem? It seems like the US is going fine. The economy is going fine. It's growing. Unemployment's at all-time lows or historic lows. The economy's in good shape. People seem relatively happy. So what is there to fix? What is the underlying problem which Trump and his team are trying to fix? And what is the plan to fix it? And what are the implications of that plan? So let's get into the problem first. What exactly is it? So on the face of it, as I said, the US economy is going fine. The world economy is kind of going fine. But underlying those numbers, what is true is that in America, the middle class, lower middle class, have been left behind by quote-unquote progress. Manufacturing has been outsourced to China. Everyone has benefited from cheap Chinese goods. But in terms of the auto worker in Michigan or other great swathes of the middle class in America, they've been left behind in terms of wage growth and employment growth. And that's caused all kinds of inequalities, and I'll get into that in a second. Secondly, government spending now is half the economy in America. And a lot of the growth of late has come from government spending and government employment. Again, that's a problem. And the private sector is becoming isolated in terms of capital deployment. And that growth in government debt, which has supported that government spending, has become unsustainable. I've talked about government debt in the US quite a lot. I'll talk about that in a second, again, to remind you of where we are in terms of the debt pile and the interest payments on that debt pile. And then behind that is money printing, because if you're spending a lot of money as a government, then to fill the gap in terms of sustaining and taking on more debt, often money printing lies behind that. And we've seen a lot of money printing. I've talked about this over the last many years. Around $30 trillion of money printing globally. That's 30% of GDP. That helps keep things going, but it also leads to inflation. And again, back to the middle class, we've seen pretty rampant inflation in America in the last few years. Prices have gone up by around about 20+% over the last few years in America. But if you take the basket of goods which affects the middle class, groceries particularly, it's almost double that. It's high 30%. That's a real problem. And then finally, China is, again, I've covered this, is winning. So far, in my opinion, in a multipolar world. And that is, I think, Trump's opinion as well. China is winning, and a pushback is required in terms of that new world order. So lots to fix from the Trump team's point of view. And just to put some flesh on that in terms of the problem statement, this is, I think, in one chart, probably sums it up. This goes back to 1930, US consumer spending, US GDP, US industrial production. They've all tracked each other up until 2000. When China was admitted to the World Trade Organization, and China became the manufacturing powerhouse, which we've now become used to. From that point on, US consumer spending carried on, US GDP carried on, but US industrial production flatlined. So in the last 25 years or so, last 25 years, US industrial production has actually been pretty much flat, whereas the economy has grown by, 60%. And that's supported by the government spending and the money printing. So that's a problem in terms of your manufacturing base and your ability to be sustainable as a world power. And what that's led to is, as I've said, pretty much stagnant wage growth for the vast majority of people, the middle class. That is most people in America. This chart goes back to 1950s. And if you see from the late 1960s to today, what is that, 50, almost 60 years, for the bottom 90% of people. So for most people in America, real incomes have been flat. That's an extraordinary stat. For the top 10% of people in America, real incomes have doubled and more. So 90% real incomes have been flat. And if you take the wealth distribution, it's even worse. So if you take this chart, it's hard to see the y-axis, but the top 1% in America now own 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60% of the wealth. The top 1% own 60% of the wealth. And that's doubled over the last, 40 years, the period we're talking about. On the bottom, the rest, basically, have gone from 20% of the wealth to less than 10% of the wealth. And that wealth inequality leads to the social polarization, the difficulties we're seeing in terms of inequality, what that leads to in terms of society in America and elsewhere. So that bedrock of society's frame, and Trump is leaning into that to try and, quote unquote, fix that. The second leg is government is half the economy. This is a chart which shows you federal spending plus state and local government spending, so the totality of government spending into the economy. This goes up to 2020 and it hit 47%. Today, that would be like over 50%. I think 54% of the economy is now the government. And once you get above 50%, that becomes a real problem for economies because the private sector can't flourish. It doesn't have enough capital spending going into it. And government spending is fine, but you can't go on and on like that forever. You can't just keep on taking on debt. And that's been the engine of the economy, surprisingly. It's been really the government to a large extent, particularly in terms of employment. And supporting that has been the debt taken on. I've told this for a little while, for the first 220 years of the US's existence. It's its 250th year anniversary next year in 2025, 26, I think. For the first 220 years, it took on a total of $1 trillion of debt. It's now taking on an additional $1 trillion of debt every 3 months. And the total debt pile is now around $36 trillion and growing. That is an unsustainable pathway, and something really does have to be done about it. Because the interest payments on that, particularly as interest rates go up on that greater debt, this is a chart which shows you interest payments are at $900 billion per annum. It's now more like $1.2, $1.3 trillion per annum in interest payments. Defense spending is about $800 billion per annum. So, and you can see the shape of that chart. You know, this is an unsustainable situation in terms of where the government finds itself. And you won't be able to read this, but this is an interesting chart, and I'll kind of convey it back to you. This is the breakdown of government spending in America. So keep this in your head. You've got $36 trillion of debt. The government spends per annum $6.7 trillion. It brings in revenues, taxes, etc., $4.5 trillion. So there's a $2 trillion deficit. You can't run a household like that for very long. That $2 trillion deficit has to be financed every year with extra debt issued and money printed and interest payments on that debt. The interesting thing about this chart is in the last 4 years, that totality of government spending, the 6.7 trillion, has grown by 52% in 4 years. We've had inflation as well, but in real terms, it's up 26%. Government spending is up 52% in normal terms in 4 years to that 6.7 trillion number. Again, that is an unsustainable trajectory. Lots of government spending, lots of money printing. Money printing leads ultimately to inflation because you put more money into the economy, then inflation is the result. It's just the maths. This is an interesting chart. This is US prices going back to 1800, just the level of prices. And you can see prices were static. Level of prices are pretty much the same for 150 years up to World War II. And since that time, prices in America have gone up 8-fold. So we've become inflationary economies. I could get into that, but that's a longer term story. And you can see at the very end of this chart, there's a little spike in inflation, in price level. That's inflation. And as I said, the grocery basket for the vast majority of Americans is up mid 30% in totality in the last 4 years. And that's a big problem for any economy. And then finally, outside of the domestic economy, in terms of being a government-driven money printing economy, in terms of the new multipolar world we find ourselves in, China is winning in that multipolar world. To remind you, the hegemonic power of the US used to control everything post the Cold War. China's come up, US has retreated. You've got a multipolar situation. Everyone's vying for power, and China looks like it's winning that battle. This is just one stat. I could show you many. These are exports of passenger cars. The red line is China. So exports of passenger cars into the world from China have gone from 0.5 million units, what's that, 4 years ago, to 4 million units. So 8x. They've gone eightfold. And this is why we see BYDs and such like everywhere in all the economies we live in. So Chinese cars are everywhere, and this is why. They're winning the electric vehicle battle. Meanwhile, German exports have gone from 4.5 million to, what's that, 3 million. US exports are down. South Korean exports are down. Japan exports are down. China is winning. And it's winning all over the place. I've shown this chart a couple of times. Solar panel production. The light blue bar on the chart is 2005. The dark blue bar is current. So solar panel production as a proportion of the world has gone from 11% from China to 88% from China. So if you've got a solar panel on your roof, it is from China. Civilian drones has gone from 0% to 75%. Mobile phone production, 67%. High-speed trains, lithium batteries, 63%. So China is dominating manufacturing production for the world in all of these important new economy items. And they're winning that battle. And you could frame the US in different terms, but I'll come back onto that. This is important in terms of that Chinese dominance. China is now projecting that dominance in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, in terms of a $8 trillion infrastructure project across the world. This is soft and hard power of China radiating out across land, sea, space, polar and digital, into Africa, into Europe, and now into Latin America. And you could describe the US as being kind of peak of empire. The US has been dominant for many decades, probably most of the last century, in fact. And now you're starting to see the peak of empire. And I compared it to Rome in a previous webinar. And just quickly down these things, it's actually quite interesting. This is Rome at peak of empire, which is around 189 AD. They didn't realize it at the time, but that was their peak. Declining economic strength, US, yes. Reluctance to engage overseas, withdrawal from the Middle East, United States, yes. Rome, I could go through Rome, I won't go through Rome today, but the parallels are there. Declining geopolitical reach, US, tick. High inequality, Gini coefficient. Rome is 0.43, that's a high number. The US is 0.42. What I've been talking about in terms of inequality in the society, big problem. Rising populism, I think we're seeing that. Excess leisure time, that's true, I could prove that to you, but I won't today. A voice to the mob, certainly, and that was the Colosseum in Rome's days. Today it's Twitter / X. It's become very noisy. This polarization and the voices aired on X are noisy and sometimes quite nasty. Wealthy move to the fringes, I can prove that to you, etc. So this is the problem statement Trump and his team are attempting to address. Make America great again. That is what they're trying to do, and by solving the domestic economy and reaching out overseas. Okay, so how are they going to do that? What is the plan? And sometimes it's hard to believe there is a plan. Many people tell me, what could it possibly be? I mean, and that's the noise. Enormous amounts of noise. Not all of it good by any means. And I know this is a very polarizing debate, but the noise is swamping the signal. My job is to get to the signal. What is the plan? 1, move back to global spheres of influence. I'll cover each of these points in turn. Number 2, ensure fair trade as part of that. Get government spending under control. Unleash private sector investment. Reduce inflation. Not price levels, let's be realistic, but reduce inflation. And then cut / remove personal taxes for the majority of people. Not the rich, it'll be for the middle classes. So let's start with global spheres of influence. This is why, and I'll get back on the foreign policy in a second. This is why Trump's craziness around Greenland, Panama, Canada we'll put to one side. I think that is just noise. And NATO are important because Trump wants to strengthen that North Atlantic Alliance. I'll call it the North Atlantic Alliance. And if you look at this map, he wants to strengthen that North Atlantic Alliance as one sphere of influence. He wants Russia, Middle East, Eurasia in the middle, and then China's sphere of influence in the Far East. Because you can't beat everyone. We're not going back to a US hegemony. The world order is changing. It has changed. And so those sphere of influences need to become more balanced. And that lies behind a lot of what he's doing in terms of Greenland, in terms of Ukraine, in terms of China. I'll come back onto each. To get to that position, he also needs to ensure fair trade as best he can. And it is true that tariffs levied by the US on other people are lower, generally speaking, than the tariffs other people levy on the US. This chart shows that. On the y-axis is the tariff applied by the US on other people, compared to the x-axis, which is the tariff applied to the US by those other people. So if you take just one of those dots on the bottom right, let's say, if you look at the 12% number, that's probably India. So the tariff levied by the US on India is 2%. The tariff levied by India on US goods is 12%. So all the dots are on the right-hand side of the chart. So that's telling you that the US is being hard done by in terms of trade. Just on this measure, there are lots of other ways to look at this. But in terms of that tariff equation, that is undoubtedly true. And I'll give you another chart to show you the same thing. Average tariffs in the US before this spat in the last few weeks, average tariffs on your overseas goods were give or take 2.2%. The equivalent numbers in terms of tariffs on import taxes, basically on imports coming in, Canada 3.4%, cast your eye left to right, Europe is kind of high twos, India 12%, I've mentioned South Korea 8.4%, whereas China 3%, actually not too bad to be fair. But then they'll talk about currency manipulation, etc. Brazil and Chile 6.6%. So there is a tariff equalization, which is part of this plan in terms of the tariff spat we're seeing. And so President Trump stood up in the Rose Garden last Wednesday, and with this strange board, showed the reciprocal, quote unquote. So I won't get into the mechanism of this because it's a very strange mechanism, I must confess, and that's adding to the noise, which is not helpful. But it resulted in very high tariffs, much higher tariffs than the market was clearly expecting, and that created a lot of the market falls we've seen in the last couple of weeks. So tariffs are much higher. What was the plan? That can result in lots of things. In terms of in Trump's mind, there are three good things to come out of this large tariff board. And by the way, it's a big shift. This chart shows you the average tariff from America on other people back to the 1920s. Peaked at 20% in the 1920s, 1930s. I won't go into that now. It's now 2%. It's back up to 22%. Big move. So what does he want to see out of this? There's three things. Number one, you put an import tax on, you collect revenue. From whoever it is, you do collect revenue, which you otherwise wouldn't get. So tariff revenue, they're looking to raise billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into the government coffers, which helps us to solve the government deficit issue. Number two, onshoring. If you're a company manufacturing overseas, exporting to America, you hit a big tariff, you're more likely to set up in America to avoid the tariff. Onshoring. Takes a while, you don't build factories overnight. Will that work? Don't know. It hasn't really been tried before. This is a big experiment, must be said. It hasn't really been tried before. You are seeing some hundreds of billions coming in. I think that would have happened kind of anyway. You've got SoftBank with $500 billion, Apple with $500 billion, Nvidia with hundreds of billions, etc. So there is some onshoring going on. And if you add it up, it's about 1.5 trillion. Pretty good, actually, within 2 months. Biden took in 1 trillion in terms of direct investment into the US economy. So it's been 1.5 trillion so far. So that onshoring is kind of working. I think Trump is pre-tariff, Trump is very friendly to that. I think maybe the tariffs may be backfiring in that regard, but we'll see. So onshoring was the second one. And the third one is what we're seeing now, actually, which is doing deals. So if you look at some particular instances in terms of what those tariffs look like on particular products, compared to the averages I mentioned earlier. India, for example, 12% average. Motorcycles, US motorcycles in India, 30% tariff. Into the US from India, 2.4%. European Union on cars is a 10% tariff, 2.5% tariff into America. I could go on. So there definitely are instances of where things are, quote unquote, unfair. And so those are the three things: onshoring, more revenue, and do deals to have fairer trade across the board. And the market, before the announcements the last couple of days, was telling you, this is Polymarket, one of my favorite prediction markets, was telling you that deals were likely to be done. So which countries will Trump reduce tariffs on before June? Vietnam, India, Cambodia, Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, Japan, China. We'll see about China. And what has happened in response to those very large tariffs is all these countries have gone to the White House and they want a trade deal. And this is the classic Trump negotiating tactic. Put something impossible out there, show you'll do it, and then bring people to the table to a sensible deal. And that's what's happening now. And so we are seeing all these countries, and this is going to happen in the next 3 months. There's a 90-day pause while they get the negotiations done. The one outlier, of course, is China. Currently at 145% tariffs, and I think 105% the other way. And so China, that needs to be resolved. I think they will get to a deal. They certainly have to, and that is part of the plan to get to a deal. But overall, what you're seeing is a mix of those three things. You're seeing some onshoring happening, you're seeing some revenue generation happening, and you're seeing a lot of deals being done. So it's not one of those things. All those three things can be true at the same time. And so in Trump's mind, this is really working. At the back end, will it lead to inflation? That could be a problem. Is it leading to uncertainty? Yes, that's a problem. Will we get a recession as a result? Very possibly. That's not the desired outcome from Trump's point of view. We'll get back onto that in a second. Okay, so tariffs is one leg. The second leg is reduced government spending. I talked about this a lot last time we were together. This is Doge. Again, I'm not going to get into the emotive aspects of this in terms of the execution of it. A lot of it has been, fairly brutal. A lot of it, I'm sure, has been unfair. What I am clear about is that something did need to be done, and presidents almost throughout history have tried to reduce government spending. So there's nothing unusual about reducing government spending. And if you want to see how they're going about it, you can go to doge.gov, meet the US government. And this is the executive branch, just dwell on this for a second. 2.2 million people in direct government, federal level government, 16,000 offices, quite a lot. $211 billion of wages. The average, you can't see that on here actually, the average wage paid to a government employee is $94,000 per annum. That's sounding quite high. And at the bottom there, the number of actual agencies, the actual number of government agencies. You can add those up, 34 plus 43 plus 63 plus 119. That's about 250 government agencies. De facto strikes you quite a lot. A lot of these are being closed down, a lot are being reduced. And you can see exactly what's happening again on doge.gov. It's going across all the agencies, from the Department of Education to the Department of State to the Department of Defense. And if you want to go through every single action they're taking, again, doge.gov, it'll take every single contract cancelled, every single program cancelled, every single action. For example, this is, I'll read it out. Contract update. Agencies terminated 80 wasteful contracts today with a ceiling value of $203 million and savings of $139 million. Okay, sounds quite good. Including a $2.1 million State Department management consulting contract for a senior advisor in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Okay, I'm not against supporting Congo, but $2.1 million for one person, that sounds like quite a lot. So that's an example. You could look up lots of these examples. And so far, they've saved about $140 billion. Remember the 2 trillion number? They need to save $1 trillion out of that on the cost side without revenues coming in. So that's after about a month. So it's a pretty good effort. And what will this land with in terms of wealth redistribution and income redistribution? We're going back to the beginning in terms of this inequality within US society, which has been the result. The idea, if this all works, is to redistribute from the wealthy to the poorer. I'll call it the middle class. This chart is quite instructive. In terms of the taxes paid by wealth demographic, the top 1% pay, give or take, half the taxes in America. The top 1% pay half the tax bill. The bottom 50% at the bottom there pay, 2% of the tax bill? And so what Trump wants to do is, actually, his aim is to reduce income taxes for anyone earning less than $150,000 in America, 2-0. So abolish income tax for anyone earning less than $150,000 in America. That's give or take 80% of the population. If you can do that, that will transform America and society, and will be an extraordinary, I'll call it an experiment. It's never been done before. But that is the plan. We'll see if it works. Let's talk about foreign policy before we get on to markets. Okay. Again, in the back of your mind is the bottom point here, which is extend geopolitical sphere of influence. Neutralize any Chinese threat, stop the war in Ukraine, Middle East I'll come to, secure Gaza ceasefire. Let's go through each in turn. Ukraine, first of all. Again, I've talked a lot about this. I do expect a peace deal of some kind. Again, I'm not opining on who are the good guys and the bad guys here. I'm just telling you what I think will happen, for better or for worse. We'll get a peace deal. Russia will get the Donbass and Crimea, which is the area in red on this map. Ukraine will not be allowed to join NATO. There will not be European boots on the ground as a peacekeeping force, and there will be minerals deal done. And that kind of US presence surrounding the minerals deal will be enough as a deterrent in terms of further conflict. That's what I suspect is going to happen. Lying behind this is that there are a lot of minerals in Ukraine. Outside of the dreadful human cost of this whole thing, there are minerals to be fought over as well. A lot of them are in the Donbass, so those will go to Russia, but a lot are outside the Donbass, probably about 50-50. And there's about $30 trillion of minerals in Ukraine. Russia is $75 trillion of minerals. That's a lot of minerals, by the way. US $45 trillion. Ukraine is not on this chart. It's never really been mapped properly, but it's about $30 trillion, give or take, is the estimate. So, that's kind of a big prize at the end of this as well. So I expect that to happen. And there's a reason why the Ukraine-Russia peace talks, US-Russia talks initially, happened in Saudi Arabia. And there's a reason why there were US-Russian talks excluding Ukraine, excluding Europe, because the talks were about, again, for better or for worse, bringing Russia back into the global economic and financial system. So the US wants Russia back in the system because by isolating Russia, Russia is becoming too friendly with China. And that Russia-China bloc is too powerful for the US. So they need Russia back in the game and closer to the US as a rebuff to China. That's the play. The reason it happened in Saudi Arabia, under the tutelage of Mohammed bin Salman, the leader, de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, MBS, is that Saudi Arabia are being positioned as the new power broker in the Middle East. So this is Trump's grand plan for the Middle East. It started with the Abraham Accords under President Trump's last term, where diplomatic relations were resumed between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. Saudi Arabia were about to join those Abraham Accords just before October 7th. Trump will want to reinvigorate those Abraham Accords, have Saudi in, have other countries in, with Saudi as the de facto leader alongside Israel. That'll be the peace bloc. Pressure will be brought to bear on Iran, starting this Saturday, with a call between Trump and presumably the leader of Iran. Pressure will be brought to bear on Iran to neutralize Iran effectively. This is why the Houthi war is going on, in terms of an Iranian proxy being pounded right now. Get Iran back into its box in terms of no nuclear weapon production. Iran is very close to producing a nuclear weapon, just to be clear. They need to be denuclearized. And Trump will pressure them using oil sanctions, which were not used under Biden, sadly, by using oil sanctions on Iran to neutralize Iran. That's the grand plan for the Middle East. It's an incredibly complicated and difficult thing to do. People have tried to do it for decades. There remains the Palestinian issue, clearly. And it's hard to see how the moving parts can come together, but that is the plan. I hope something works, because we've been trying at this for a very, very long time, and hundreds of thousands of people have died as a result. Which brings me to Greenland. Again, talked about this before, so I'll be quite quick on this. As a reminder, Greenland is not a joke. It's very important. It sits strategically in a very important place for the next few decades, because it's the entryway to the Arctic Ocean and sits flat bang between Russia and North America. Greenland is 2/3 the size of India. It's very large. It has a lot of minerals. And the Arctic ice cap is melting. The Arctic ice cap is about half what it was before, which means that ships can start to go through. And ships going that route, it saves about 30% of your shipping time between America, Europe, Asia. So you don't have to go through the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal. That saves 30% of your shipping time, which is huge for global trade. The control of the shipping lines is critical. Unlike the Antarctic, where mineral drilling is banned, drilling for minerals in the Arctic, for better or for worse, is not banned. And China want to drill there, and Russia want to drill there. It's estimated that 1/3 of remaining global oil supplies are in the Arctic Ocean and Greenland. So this is militarily, economically critical in terms of that control function. So the Greenland conversation is a very sensible one to be having. I don't think these are the minerals. These are minerals in Greenland. 1.5 million rare earths. Rare earths power everything in our lives today, including this computer screen and, of course, your mobile phone and your vehicle, be it electric or not. Shipping, I've talked about. Geopolitical prize. So Greenland is a critical conversation. I don't think America is serious about taking over Greenland at all, but it has attempted to purchase Greenland before, twice. So this is the third time America has tried to purchase Greenland. It tried to purchase it in 1867 for $15 million. Congress blocked that because they just bought Alaska. Tried to buy it after World War II, and it's trying to buy it now. Whether it buy it or not, it just wants influence. The US wants influence over Greenland. The US has got 2 military bases there right now, including a spaceport, and one of the missile detection systems over the North Pole. So this is critical. And Russia and China are already moving in. Russia has 41 icebreakers there already. China spent $500 billion already in the Arctic region and wants to be an Arctic power. So this is proper stuff and needs to be sorted. And I'll finish with NATO in terms of the sphere of influence discussion. And by the way, that Greenland Arctic discussion falls into the North Atlantic Treaty or North Atlantic Alliance situation, which brings me to NATO. And Trump wants NATO to be powerful. He doesn't want to withdraw from NATO, but he wants Europe to pay its fair share and be a strong partner for America within that North Atlantic Alliance. And Europe has not been spending much on defense, as I'm sure many people are now aware. Trump did raise this many years ago. The NATO guideline is 2% of GDP on defense spending. That's not a guideline. That's actually a minimum, in fact, is what it should be. 2% of GDP is actually what it is. These are all the NATO countries. They are all, with the exception of America, in light blue below that 2% guideline or minimum. They've now increased a lot. Trump is now pushing them to 5%, and they are moving through that 2%. That has to be in place, and all the bullying is around getting them to do that to make them a stronger partner within that North Atlantic Alliance. Because if they're not, then this US dependency is going to continue. And by the way, the US can't afford it anymore because of my government spending point. So if you take defense expenditure on NATO, the light blue is NATO Europe plus Canada, bless them, and the dark blue is the United States. The United States dominates the share of NATO spending. And that's got to equalize more to make Europe a stronger partner so the North Atlantic Alliance is a strong sphere of influence. That is why this is happening. That's the hidden agenda. I'm not going to go through that today. Let's take a pause on the slides. So what you've got is a plan in terms of sphere of influence, in terms of rebuilding the US economy, and in terms of neutralizing the Chinese threat, to put it bluntly, in terms of the geopolitical landscape. This is the US versus China, the great power game of the 21st century. The issue really is, in the near term, the means of getting there. Other means can be more damaging than the end game if the end game does work. And we're seeing a lot of noise in markets. We're seeing a lot of noise in economies. We're seeing a lot of uncertainty. And these tactics which Trump uses, naturally, the art of the deal, asking for the impossible, putting ridiculous things out there, is fine when you and I are negotiating. But in terms of a global scale, you can say it's just too unsettling for the world economy. So is that going to be too damaging in the near term? And what we've seen in the last few weeks is markets do not like uncertainty. This is the US Trade Policy Uncertainty Index. Yeah, I think it's fair to say it's gone up. COVID, you can see, got to 2,000 on this index. It's now 6,000. That's very damaging for trade, for investment, and for markets. So there's a real effect and a market effect. And markets went completely berserk in the last couple of weeks. This is the volatility index. It trades between 15 and 20 generally. It jumped to 60. It got to about 80 during COVID, to be fair. But the volatility in markets in intraday in the last few weeks has been rarely seen. And you can see it here. This was the 2-day fall, post-tariff announcement. Black Monday, 1987. Some of us lived through that. Global financial crisis, COVID-19. You can see that's on the same scale, reciprocal tariffs. So this is kind of the 4th/5th event since Second World War of this magnitude. So this is, this is big stuff, and in itself has an effect on confidence. And Trump doesn't like this. These are this is the S&P 500 index by president. So Biden actually had a really good 4 years, must be said. In blue up there, S&P went up a lot for lots of different reasons, but good for him. Obama did a pretty good time. Trump had a pretty good time. Trump 25 in red. Yeah, that's not a pretty chart for Trump because he loves the market going up. The thing which freaked him out, by the way, was the bond market, not the equity market, last week or this week. When the bond market starts to get dysfunctional in America, the US Treasury market, which it was getting a couple of days ago, that's when things get alarming. That's why he stepped back in terms of the 90-day pause, just to be clear. But he doesn't like that scene. And, the market is coming from, part of the reason for this, by the way, this red, falling off chart, is that the market's at high levels. So it's more likely to come down. And I'll be talking this for a little while. This is the US relative to the rest of the world. Internet bubble, Nifty 50 bubble, we're 2 standard deviations above those bubbles in terms of the US versus the rest of the world. So the US is riding high, the AI bubble, the tech bubble, we've been talking about that. So it was due for fall anyway, quite honestly. It was partly looking for a reason to fall, and it found a reason to fall and fell pretty sharply, partly because the market was so concentrated. Been talking about this. Top 5 stocks in the market in the US, 30% of the market, top 5 stocks: Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet. 30% of the market. Last time that concentrated was the Nifty 50 in 1965. Of course, that concentration falls. When a very concentrated market, it tends to be a quite vulnerable market because there's too much going on, too few names. And that's starting to deflate. So we're seeing the Magnificent Seven, as we call them, those big tech names fueled by the AI hype. AI is real, but sometimes the market gets ahead of itself. So this is peaked to kind of today-ish. Magnificent Seven are down about 20%. Something like Nvidia from its peak will be down about 35%, and Tesla's halved. So you're seeing some big moves out of tech. So that tech bubble is deflating. That's the background noise, if you like, as well at the moment, which is a good thing. That tech bubble needed to deflate. The hype needed to come out to get the market to a more sensible level. We're starting to see slightly more sensible levels from markets. Again, I've been on about this for quite a long time. The market's expensive. It's becoming now less so as a result of this. That's good news for people who want to buy markets and invest in markets. And that goes back to, we're down now to about 18 times on the S&P. So to compare that to other markets, here we go. So let's see where markets have got to. Where are we today? The US market is on about 18 times price earnings ratio. That's the ratio we generally use as professional investors. 18 times PE. There's lots of other market metrics, but PE, let's talk about that. 18 times. Compared to previous kind of bear markets, if we are in a bear market, the median would be about 14 times. So it could have more downside if it is a bear market. We've got a 20% correction. The way I like to look at it is in terms of relative to other markets. So US on 18 times, China 11 times, Europe 12 times, give or take today. South Africa, for my local friends, will be on about 10 times. Emerging markets on about 11 times. That's 10, 11, 12 times. I like that kind of multiple compared to 18. So we're starting to see value emerging in non-US markets. And I think that's where the opportunity lies, if there is an opportunity. So however, and I'll wrap up in a moment, and if there are any questions, pop them in the box and I'll try and handle them. The however is this uncertainty point. And uncertainty is coming at the US economy in a number of ways. Number one is inflation. We've talked about this quite a lot. Inflation tends to come in waves. It's gone from a peak down a bit to, but it's at about 3%, not 2%. 3% is not great, and now expectations are picking up to 4 or 5%. So you could get another inflation move upwards. That would be bad news, because that means interest rates can't come down in response to a possible recession or down or falling growth. Two charts on that. University of Michigan survey. We're going to get the newest survey actually out today, later. But a lot of respondents now expect higher unemployment over the next 12 months. So that uncertainty has bled into surveys in terms of expecting job markets to be more difficult. And weekly bankruptcy filings have even gone up. This is actually pre-tariff. And so you're seeing some weakness in the overall economy anyway. And I've said this, I think, a number of times before. This is Trump's Achilles heel. In terms of his grand plan, if in the meantime, partly through his actions, but only partly, but partly through his actions, we get a recession and prices going up, we get stagflation, that's when people will tend to turn on him even more, in terms of actually his own camp will turn on him. And that could be a problem. When things are going basically okay, in terms of the real economy, it's okay. Recession, not okay. And we're starting to see this. This is a very interesting, this is probably my penultimate chart, very interesting chart. This is kind of real-time data. It's published by the Atlanta Fed, their GDP Now model, GDP Now. And it's based on real-time data feeding into a GDP measure. And this is, again, pre-tariffs. Q1 GDP in America is estimated to have gone from plus 3.9% in February to minus 2.8% today-ish, probably 2 weeks ago. So plus 4% to minus 3%. That's a massive move. And if that's true, then we're heading for some much more difficult times in America. So summary. Number one, there is a plan. I'm going to take a couple of questions. I can see some popping in here. There is a plan. There's a lot of noise, but there is a plan behind it. Like it or not, there is a plan. Whether it works or not is out there. It has not been tried before, certainly not on this scale, in terms of reordering your domestic economy away from government and towards private enterprise, and away from offshore manufacturing and towards domestic manufacturing. That has never been done in modern history at this scale. While at the same time, reordering the global economy, both in terms of trade and in terms of geopolitical influence. So the flooding the zone, as the Trump administration would call it, in terms of doing a lot of things at the same time, we could end up in a position where it's just too much. Is execution too messy? At the same time, we do need to keep our eyes on the signal. It's getting tough to do. I've tried to replay that today as I see it. There is a signal there, but it's getting harder to get to, which feeds back into the uncertainty point as well in terms of the potential damage to the economy in the meantime. For me, what will the world look like in a year's time? That's the key thing. Will the reordering have worked? Or will there be too much collateral in the meantime? We will know in a year's time. What I will say is that, and let's drop these slides and take a question or two. What I will say is that there is some value emerging in markets now, particularly outside the US. So the current volatility looks like more of an opportunity to me than a threat, I think, in the near term. And easing into markets at this point is probably, could be a sensible thing to do, particularly outside the US. So I think that's quite interesting. The however is that it could get worse, this uncertainty quotient, and we could end up in a bear market. So markets fall by more. That could certainly happen. So it's on a knife edge, quite honestly, at the moment. But in terms of the longer term prospects, I think opportunity is starting to emerge. But I would be fairly, easing into that, not leaning into it. And then in a year's time, we will find out whether this extraordinary experiment, again, like it or loathe it, will have worked. If it works in a year's time, it'll be the most extraordinary thing. And if it hasn't worked, it'll be a complete calamity. I hope it works, just for all of us, personalities and presidents aside. Two questions. Please comment on the recent US regulation allowing banks to invest in cryptocurrencies. Yes, I can comment on cryptocurrencies. The US and Trump is very pro-crypto for lots of reasons. What they have realized is that the US is behind, in my opinion. I think they have realized it. It's behind in the AI game. it is also in danger of being behind in the crypto game, and it needs to be ahead in both, because crypto will power a lot of the future economy, which will be powered by AI. So the talk about a US Bitcoin strategic reserve and backing AI and unleashing AI is a necessary quotient when China are doing better than you and going to encroach on you. So crypto will be fine. Why does Team Trump simply not frame it in a more sensible way? I think that's probably the guts of that question. Listen, again, this is, do you need to be this brutal and this out there to get things done? Could you have got 75 countries to the table with their begging bowls, quite honestly, to negotiate a sensible trade deal with America without this big stick having come out? I doubt it, quite honestly. I doubt it. Will it be too much collateral damage? I'm not sure. We're going to see. But I don't think we'd have made the progress in that sense we have seen without it being this brutal. What are your views on China's attempts to strengthen relations with Europe? Yes. China, it's interesting. Overnight, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, was talking about these trade deal conversations leading to a world bloc, which could then discuss trade deals with China. So you can see how they're trying to bring that North Atlantic alliance towards them, away from China. China's trying to do the opposite thing by negotiating with Europe. So China is quite concerned about this whole thing, which is why I think they will come to the table and there will be a deal done. Finally, how are you thinking about liquidity risk if we get a credit event this year? It's a very good question. This is the collateral damage thing. Is there too much uncertainty? Will we get some kind of liquidity event? We were close to one, I think a few days ago, or a couple of days ago, in the Treasury market. That's why Trump had to blink, even though it was framed in terms of a negotiation, which is also partly true. But we're getting close to that because money is running a little bit scared at the moment and it's extraordinarily volatile. There is a risk of that. And if we get that, then the Fed will intervene and we'll get lower interest rates. That Fed put is probably still there, even though they're very concerned about inflation. Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you all for being here for such a long time. I really appreciate it. Hopefully that was helpful in terms of deciphering what's going on. I'm sure we'll keep talking about it and let's hope for the very best. Thanks very much.